Good afternoon, and welcome to our second Civil Rights Series program here at Volunteer State Community College. We're particularly honored and delighted to have two veterans of the Civil Rights Movement with us today. We have Kwame Lillard here to my right, whom you saw talking about going to the store with his mother and wondering why there were two water fountains. And then we have Matthew Walker Jr. here as well, whose mother was quite stressful. It was a stressful experience for her when she found out her son had been arrested and taken to jail. So before we begin, let's all give them a nice round of applause for coming to our campus today. We are going to have a conversation with Mr. Lillard and Mr. Walker about what actually was going on here in Nashville and Middle Tennessee in the 1950s and the 1960s. So let's begin with a general question of how old were each of you when you realized that you were living in a segregated society? What are your first memories of living in a segregated society where there were places you could not go?
Well, the water fountain, and then there was no toilets. So there's an alley in Nashville on between 5th and 6th Avenue that borders Church and Union Street. That was our bathrooms. So the women urinated in the northern part of the alley behind boxes, and the men urinated in the southern part of the alley behind boxes. It was okay in the winter, but can you imagine what it smelled like in the summer? Many veteran civil rights people have forgotten that because it's too painful to remember. Some things you just blot out. But when we started doing tours about 10 years ago, we stopped at that alley and recalled that very same shameful feature of downtown that was reserved for black people. And something you did, you didn't question it. If you were downtown, you had to go to the bathroom, you peed in the alley, all right? So we were so proud when the movement started. We said, that's one target we're gonna focus on after the lunch counter. We can pee in a real toilet. That sounds funny, but when you're 19 years old and your grandparents have peed in the alley for 50 years, it's something you didn't question. You just did it. Except we were 19 years old, and we questioned it. We said, basically, if not us, who? If not now, then when? So that's many, many of those things you accepted as a kid, and you questioned your parents, and they said, that's the way it is. God's going to change it. Pray about it. But you know, 19-year-olds don't pray about much.
Yeah.
They make things happen.
They make things happen. And what a humiliation that must have been for male and females alike to have to be sent somewhere so degrading as the alley. Mr. Walker, what were your earliest memories of segregation and the limitations that it put on your life?
Well, that's a good question. I think my earliest memories of segregation, I was too young to understand what segregation was. I can remember riding home on the bus from downtown with my mother when we'd been downtown shopping. We would have to go to the back of the bus. I could have been 6 or 7 years old, and we went to the back of the bus. Seats were crowded. There were no seats, except one seat in the back of the bus, and that seat was right next to another seat, which was empty, and a white policeman was sitting in one of those seats, and he had his hand in the other seat to keep anybody else from sitting there. And I thought that was strange. And I asked my mother about it when we got home, and she told us, you know, that's segregation, and that's the way it was, and white people were like that, and so forth. So I think that may have been my earliest memory of segregation.
And you had to ride in the back of the bus, and if white people were there, you had to stand up. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, will you tell our audience here today about your parents, because I think their story is actually quite interesting. Tell them who your father was.
Well, I chose my parents well.
Good.
My father was chairman and professor of surgery at Meharry Medical College from 1945 to 1973. And he played a pivotal role in the movement. I do believe that my family participated in the movement to a greater extent than any other movement participant. My father was finance chairman for the capital campaign for NCLC at one point. He was instrumental in raising funds throughout the time of the movement. I believe it's safe to say that he raised more money directly and indirectly than any other individual during 1960, the time of the sit-ins. At various points in time, he brought Sidney Poitier to Nashville to help with the fundraising. He also brought Harry Belafonte to Nashville to help with the fundraising. And he was active in terms of speaking at regular community meetings, which took place throughout the city at different churches, different weeks. So my father was very active in terms of supporting the sit-ins. And once we had successfully integrated the downtown lunch counters, he encouraged us to have a party, which we did, invited many other people, participated in the sit-ins, and it was a good time to celebrate, which we did, and it was a lot of fun. My mother was instrumental in ferrying students back and forth from downtown to their respective campuses, providing sandwiches and so forth for students when needed, helping operate the telephone tree, which was a way to get the word out. In case you don't know, the telephone tree was a means of communication where one person would call another, that person would call another, that person would call another, and each person had 10, 12 people they would call to get the word out. So my mother participated with the telephone tree. And my sister was among the first arrested on February 27th, 1960. I was among the second group arrested on that date. So I had family participation insofar as the movement was concerned. My parents were very supportive of what I did, what my sister did as far as participating in the sit-ins and the next year the Freedom Ride. And I'll always be grateful to them for being so supportive and understanding what we did.
When did each of you first hear the name of James Lawson, who was a Vanderbilt Divinity student who came here and began some training sessions? When do you first remember learning who James Lawson was and what he was doing at the First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill?
It wasn't First Baptist, it was Matthew's Church.
It was Matthew's Church, excuse me. So tell us about James Lawson.
Well, I started attending Fisk in the fall of 1959. James Lawson started his nonviolent training workshops at my church, Clark Memorial United Methodist Church, also in the fall of 1959. So as I went to church every Sunday there at Clark, I heard people talking about these classes. James Lawson, nonviolence. I thought it sounded curious, and so I started going. So when I first learned about James Lawson, it was the fall of 1959.
Mr. Lillard?
I grew up in First Baptist, Capitol Hill. Reverend Smith was the unquestioned leader of the movement, of the adult leadership.
Kelly Miller Smith was the minister at First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill, which was founded before the Civil War.
It came out of the white First Baptist Church on
Yes,
Broadway.
but it was founded
Correct.
out of the white Baptist church so that African Americans could have a church where they could worship as they chose to. So go ahead and talk about Mr. Smith, Reverend Smith.
Reverend Smith was a social gospel minister. He did not accept the idea of a white Jesus that only saved white people. He simply said that if there's a Jesus and there's a God, then it's for all human beings. So when I was 9 years old, we learned that concept on Sunday mornings. And as a 9-year-old, 10-year-old baptized by him, I assumed that if Kelly Miller Smith said this is the way the world should be based on how he saw it, then that's the way a 9-year-old black kid from Nashville is going to see it too. And of course, that got me in big trouble on Monday mornings at school because Kelly Miller's gospel of social justice was something that a black teacher couldn't talk about without risk of being fired. A black teacher's salary supported 3 or 4 people, guaranteed a sense of middle-class consciousness and status. So this little 9-year-old boy confronting a teacher in Metro threatened that teacher's income. So I was quickly squashed. So I was caught between 2 worlds. I was caught between Kelly's version of the beloved society and a black teacher's need to keep a job and make sure the white folks who ran the school board didn't hear anybody talk like Kelly talked in the class. So when the movement started, I was very old. I was much older than Matthew. I was a junior probably when the movement started. So I quickly joined the movement, but did not participate in the classes that Jim Lawson taught at Matthew's church, because Kelly was the unquestioned leader that brought Jim Lawson to Nashville. I knew I had to get in the movement. I knew I was going to get some revenge for all that peeing I did in the alley. So I wasn't necessarily a nonviolent advocate, but I knew as a tactic, Kelly said it would work. He said, listen to Jim Lawson, follow that drill sergeant's ideas, and we'll win this war. So when you're 19-year-old, you're 20 years old, and you know this is something that cannot lose, don't ask me how I knew we weren't going to lose, because the music said we couldn't lose. We had music that said, angle that nobody turn you around, and you're looking at 45 policemen, and you're not shaking, and they're shaking. Do you know there's something good about what you're doing? You know there's something very powerful, something inevitable about what you're doing. And that's the way we felt. So I got in the movement because Kelly and Jim were our leaders. They were our gurus. We were the 19-year-olds. They were the 30-year-olds. And it's strange sometimes after the movement started, we actually had this mantra that said, don't trust nobody over 30. But we at that point, we were brash and we could think we were invincible, could do anything. But we had great leadership. We knew we had great support. There were so many people who played so many roles. I think all we were was just the frontline troops. And you know, in any kind of war, the folks on the front line have 40 people behind them for each person on the front line. And that's the way the movement in Nashville was.
Well, as I understand it, Jim Lawson, who was a divinity school student at Vanderbilt, had started these workshops at Clark Memorial Methodist Church, and with each week, more people came to attend the workshops. When was it decided specifically that you were going to do the sit-ins on a particular February day in 1960? You were going to start, finally, after all the training, you were actually going to have some action. How was that decided?
That was decided because on February 1st, 1960, 4 students at A&T in Greensboro sat down at the lunch counter there, which began the sit-ins. So we felt that they had beat us to the punch. And we started talking to Jim and Kelly and other leaders that we needed to go ahead and get started. We had enough training. And they said, no, hold on, we need to hold on. But we prevailed, and so almost 2 weeks after the students in Greensboro began their sit-ins, we went in mass numbers on February 13th, 1960, to do our first sit-in here in Nashville. That was uneventful. Nobody paid too much attention to it. It was just a curiosity. Following Saturday, February 20th, we went downtown again. Large numbers. Again, no big deal. Curiosity. Nobody paid too much attention to us. Following Saturday, February 27th, we went downtown again. And this time, the whites attacked a white boy who was with the students, and he happened to be sitting next to my sister at the time. Some of you may have seen the photograph where they were beating Paul. He's there on the floor, and my sister's nervously looking around at the lunch counter. Police said nothing, did nothing till the white boys got through beating up Paul. They ran out of the store. None of them were arrested. The police came and arrested the blacks. And that galvanized the community, and the sit-ins began to grow after that. More people began to participate, and it just steamrolled after that.
So the violence, which the narrator of the Eyes on the Prize calls the toughs, who came in and started beating up some of the sit-in students, were not arrested, and yet that act of violence actually brought more students to participate in the sit-ins rather than scaring people away. It must have been quite an empowering thing to feel that you were finally getting to do something that might make a difference.
I think sacrifice always does that. I think our nation is built on sacrifice. The pioneers sacrifice. Everybody sacrifices. In a family, people who sacrifice seem to engender a reason for hope. And I think as I said earlier, we thought our mantra was, if not us, who? If not now, then when? And once you get started, it's electric. It just ignites the entire city. Even the folks who are criminal elements would say, I can't come down and take that beating, but I'll take you back to campus. I'll buy you some dinner. I'll give some money to get you out of jail. So it ignited everybody. Everybody was in the movement.
When did the arrests of the students start, and how was that handled?
February 27th.
Yes, the students started being arrested, and you were taken to a jail, and then what happened?
You see, what it is, we were so organized logistically. When you arrest one set of students on one set of stools in one lunch counter, there was an alley. That's that famous alley I talked about. We use the alley to ferry in new students. The students being arrested would be arrested at the front door on Fifth Avenue. The alley was between 5th and 6th. So when the students on the front got arrested, there'd be a new set of students come right in, sit right on the same stools. And the police was so unhappy.
Now, when did you all start dealing with Z. Alexander Luby? Didn't he end up representing as a lawyer the students? I'm sure you knew who he was long before the sit-ins. He was a highly respected lawyer in Nashville. How did you interact with Mr. Luby?
Well, let me just say, when you mentioned Z. Alexander Luby, that you're talking about one of the sharpest lawyers in Nashville at the time. In the 1920s, I think it was, I can remember my father telling me a tale, 1920s, 1930s perhaps. My father told me a tale about how Z. Alexander Luby had an automobile accident with a streetcar. And so they tried to charge Z. Alexander Luby with something or other because his car hit the streetcar. But he was able to prove that there was no law against what he did as far as how the accident happened, and they had to drop the charges. It was his astute knowledge about the law that led him to get off of that charge without any repercussions, and the city subsequently made a law that applied to streetcars and automobiles. So he was a primary lawyer, premier lawyer, the best black lawyer, perhaps the best lawyer in Nashville at the time. When we would get arrested, they would charge us with things like breach of peace or something like that, and it was remarkable. All the black lawyers in Nashville volunteered to help with our legal problems during that time, and Luby was just the chief lawyer. And he would make arguments and so forth against a stilted, racist court system, never did any good, but at least he represented us well as far as our case was concerned, and brought out the fact that we were fighting an unjust law, and the fact that it violated the laws of Nashville meant that there was something wrong with the laws of Nashville. And he was the catalyst, in a way, that led to the early demise of segregated lunch counters here in Nashville. Because it was April 19th, 1960, when they bombed Louis' house. Fortunately, he and his wife weren't hurt. But as galvanized a community, we got together, 6,000 strong, marched downtown, and had a series of confrontations with the mayor. Reverend C.T. Vivian accosted the mayor and accused him of turning a blind eye to the rampant police brutality which took place during the sit-ins. After that exchange, Diane Nash confronted the mayor with the issue of segregated lunch counters. After a series of questions, she asked him, what was his personal belief? Did he believe segregation was right or wrong? And he said he had the answer, he felt segregation was wrong. And with that answer, which led to the merchants finally deciding to open the lunch counters to all. So Z. Alexander Luby played a doubly distinctive role insofar as our movement was concerned. He provided us with excellent legal care, and at the same time, since he was a target of a bombing, he provided us knowingly and unwittingly with the catalyst to get the lunch counters segregated. Nashville was the first major southern city to integrate its public lunch counters.
After the students were arrested and taken to jail, the African-American leadership of the city started having some meetings of their own and raising bond money and other things, but it was decided that the African-American community was going to start a boycott of all the downtown stores, that African-Americans were not going to buy things in the stores until the lunch counters were integrated. How did that boycott get started, and what were the effects of that?
Well, there was a Fisk professor of economics, and this is the wonderful concept of a black university, HBCU.
Vivian Henderson.
Vivian Henderson. It's an idea of using everything you learn academically to apply it to social situations. In this case, Dr. Henderson from Fisk decided that the most powerful weapon we have is not singing, "We Shall Overcome," is not walking in front of a store on a picket line, but taking away white folks' money. And taking white folks' money at Easter, where Easter is one of the largest buying seasons for black families, because every little black girl on Easter has to have a new dress, new shoes, new pocketbook, new stockings, new gloves, and new hat. So imagine the kind of money that generates for the stores. Dr. Henderson of Fisk said, take the money away. Withdraw the support of an evil system. Very similar to Gandhi's tactics in India, except in this case it was a consumption habit that was kind of, we couldn't figure how you do this. But lo and behold, the entire town decided no more new clothes for Easter. That really convinced all of the major stores downtown that these black folks are serious. They're talking about bankrupting us. We better at least make some surface concessions. And they did that very quickly for very good reasons, so they would survive economically. So we had the movement, the media, and the money, all three. And that basically put the seal on where Nashville was going to go as a city.
Tell us about the editors of Nashville's two newspapers, the Tennessean and the Nashville Banner.
Well, you had polar opposites. The Tennessean was in favor, and the Banner was against what we were doing. The Tennessean wrote editorials supporting what we did, giving logical reasons about why what we did was right. And I must say that John Siegenthaler was one of those at the Tennessean who provided so much of this enlightened commentary on why what we were doing was right. He was a giant in those days, because his position was something that wasn't popular with many whites. The banner was another story. The banner was unbelievably racist. I can remember you would read the banner and you would see a story which talked about a big, black, burly Negro did such and such a thing. That was the way the banner looked at black people. They would tell lies about things that happened during the sit-ins. I can remember one story they wrote about our trip to Greyhound bus station, and they made up a whole bunch of lies about the black people threw their plate on the floor, refused to pay for the food, and created a ruckus and so forth. All this was a big fabrication. That was just the way the banner was in terms of their perception of black people. There was a man in charge of the banner named Jim Stallman. Jim Stallman was also on the board of Vanderbilt University. And it was he who caused the university to expel Jim Lawson during that time. So the banner, which has gone out of business now, thank God, was a very typical in some ways Southern newspaper insofar as its stance on race was concerned. But the two papers were just the opposite.
Now, you mentioned earlier the bombing of Mr. Luby's house, and that spontaneously caused the response of this 6,000 student march down to the courthouse. Tell us about Dr. King coming and visiting Nashville during this period of time.
Well, the next day was the 20th of April. By the way, April 19th was a very important date in the minds of people who want to live in caves. April 19th is the day that the students in Columbine went on the killing spree. April 19th is the day that the man bombed the building in Oklahoma City. Anybody know whose birthday is around April 19th? Hitler. So these dates are not happenstance, are not just eeny, meeny, miny, mo dates. These are dates that have significance to those who believe in destroying humanity. But on that day, it was clear that I think the entire town realized you can't sit and watch this man's house get bombed and nothing happens. So as the marches proceeded from TSU, which is in the western part of the town, all the way down Jefferson Street, about a 4-mile walk, folks left barbershops, beauty shops, their houses, high schools left, middle school kids left, and the march swelled all the way till we got downtown. There was at least 6,000. But the newspaper reported 4,000, but they're always undercount. So we had 6,000 people looking at the mayor and then looking at the city. And I think that was the first major mass march in the history of the movement.
And so Dr. King came to Nashville right after that.
Mm-hmm. Spoke in the Fisk Gymnasium. He tried to speak 3 different times. There was a bomb threat. 3 different times the police emptied out the gymnasium. 3 different times we refilled gymnasium until the police realized it was all a hoax. And some 3 hours after he was supposed to speak, in a humid day, he spoke for 2 hours in the gymnasium, packed. And there is a statement in the main library in Nashville that gives his sentiments to what he saw in Nashville. And basically, in the main library right now on the 2nd floor, it basically said that Dr. King says he came to Nashville not to give inspiration, but to get inspiration, because of the movement in Nashville was so profound. Dr. King's entire cabinet, all his major lieutenants from 61 on, were Nashville students.
Now, the sit-ins were successful here in Nashville, and then comes 1961 after the election of President John F. Kennedy, and an organization, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, decided that they were going to test segregation on interstate buses, and thus began the Freedom Rides. When did you Nashville students become involved with the Freedom Rides?
Well, the Freedom Ride, begun by Corps, May 1961, was an extension of what they had done earlier. They had a journey of reconciliation in 1947, fighting segregation on interstate travel. But the people from Corps were mostly Northerners. They didn't have a real understanding of how racist and vicious the South was. They went from Washington, D.C. Till they got to Anniston, Alabama, when they encountered their first violence. You all can remember seeing pictures of the bus burning in Anniston, where they stopped the bus, beat up some of the people, and so forth. Then they had a bus going to Birmingham. On that bus going to Birmingham, they had Klansmen who got on the bus and beat up some of the Freedom Riders as it was. So when they got to Birmingham, they figured that this had been just a little more than they had bargained for. So they decided to just drop the Freedom Ride and go back home because they hadn't counted on this level of violence. But students in Nashville, having had success with the sit-ins, felt that this was a mistake. We felt that we could not allow violence to overrule or overcome nonviolence. There were many discussions on Fisk campus, other campuses, about the sit-ins, about the Freedom Ride, we should go, we should not go. People said, no, don't go, it's too dangerous. If you go, you'd be like sticking your head in a lion's mouth. Other people said, no, we've got to go because we can't let violence rule, and we can't let them think that they have bested us with the age-old tactic of violence, which they've always used to control black folks. So the students from Nashville decided to go to Birmingham and start the riot all over again. So a group of students left Nashville, I think it was May 17th, 1961, went to Birmingham. And when they got to Birmingham, they were promptly arrested by the racist sheriff there, Bull Connor. He put them in jail. In the middle of the night, he spirited them away and took them to Ardmore, Alabama, Ardmore, Tennessee, a town on the border between Alabama and Tennessee. And he dropped them off.
So the police in the middle of the night dropped the college students off in the middle of nowhere?
That's
State
correct.
line.
That's a state line. And so after they dropped the students off, they were able, the students were, to find the home of a black family and call Nashville and let them know what happened. They called Nashville, and Kwame, Lillard, borrowed or stole somebody's station wagon and drove down to Ardmore, and in the middle of the night, against all odds, was able to find the house that they were in. He asked them if they want to go back to Nashville. They said, no, we're going back to Birmingham. So he drove them back down to Birmingham. And they got back to Birmingham, and a few days later, May 19th, additional students came from Nashville to start the riot again. They rode from Birmingham to Montgomery. When they got to Montgomery, the police who were escorting them disappeared. And a riot ensued. 1,000 people descended on the Freedom Riders, beat them up, put some in the hospital, beat them up pretty bad. Police let the rioters have 15 minutes before they came in and stopped it all. After that, they had a meeting at a church there in Montgomery. Again, a riot almost took place because the local citizens were enraged at the blacks for causing all this trouble. So a few days later, people got together at a house there in Montgomery, at home of Dr. Richard Harris, local pharmacist, and decided what to do next. It was the night of May 24, 1961, when many people assembled at Dr. Harris's house to discuss the future of the Freedom Ride. I, along with several others, rode down in a car driven by James Bevel, who's now deceased, rest his soul. There was also Leroy Wright in that car, Cordell Reagan, Rip Patton, and myself. We drove from Nashville to Montgomery to join the riot that day on the 24th. Incidentally, we knew that a car full of black men would probably be noticed by the police, and there's a good chance they'd just stop us because of DWB. So we decided if we would stop, we were going to tell them we're a singing group. We're going down to Montgomery to sing in a church on Sunday, Captain, and we're just a bunch of singers. We're not about anything else. But fortunately, we weren't stopped. We were able to make it to Montgomery, and there were many people at Dr. Harris's house. Most of these people were in favor of going on the riot and knew that there would be consequences for getting on that bus. Therefore, most, if not all, some who had not done so already, made out their last will and testament because they knew if there had been violence in Alabama, there could surely be killing in Mississippi. Mississippi had always been the home of the most vicious racists in the South because it had a history of killing more blacks, extrajudicial killings, when there was no punishment for killing blacks. Some of you may remember Emmett Till's lynching in 1959. You may remember Emmett Till in 1955, Mac Charles Parker lynched in 1959. There were a host of other people. You wouldn't believe how many people were killed in the 50s in Mississippi because of racist sentiment. We didn't know it at the time, but the former governor of Mississippi, John Coleman, had told a member of the Justice Department that if the Freedom Riders tried to come to Mississippi without a military escort, they would probably all be killed. We did know that the field secretary of the NAACP, Matt Gevers, warned us, do not come to Mississippi at this time. It is too dangerous. But we had our mind made up. We were not about to allow violence to stop the Freedom Ride. The most significant thing about that meeting that night at Dr. Harris's house, in my opinion, was the exchange with Dr. Martin Luther King. Early in the evening, when we were talking about the next day, Dr. King had announced that he wanted to get on the bus the next morning. I, along with others, had a problem with this, had a real problem with this. And I can remember telling him, say, look, Martin, you are the general. The general stays back in headquarters and lets the troops go to the front line. Don't get on that bus in the morning. I also told him, I said, Martin, you're a catalyst for the movement. You can wake the sleep. You can make people participate who had been apathetic before. You bring a unique gift to the movement. Your loss would surely set us back years. Don't get on that bus in the morning. Other people voiced similar sentiments. We argued with him 3 or 4 hours. It's some of the most exhilarating exchange I've ever had. The man had a mind you wouldn't believe, had a mastery of the English language, and he was in a category by himself as far as somebody who developed their intellectual potential to its fullest. After we had argued with him about 3 or 4 hours, Dr. King acceded and said, yes, okay, I won't get on the bus. I always like to bring this up because, unfortunately, many people have said Dr. King never wanted to get on the bus. That's not true. When the ride was perceived as its most dangerous, Dr. King wanted to ride. But there were those of us who felt that he shouldn't risk it because he was the man as far as the movement was concerned. Nobody had an effect on the progress of the movement that was greater than Dr. King's. So the rest of that night we spent deciding who was going to ride. People volunteered to get on the bus, and that's the way the buses were filled. The first bus consisted of 12 people. That's all we could get on that first bus. And Reverend Jim Lawson, who had taught us nonviolence, was on the bus. My pastor from Clark Memorial, Reverend Alexander Anderson, was on the bus. There was one female, a young lady from New Orleans, 18 years old, who was on the bus. She was the youngest. I was the next youngest at 19. There was one white fellow there from Washington, D.C., who was on the bus. There was one female, one white, and the other 10 were black men. We were fortunate in that we were able to go from Montgomery to Jackson without incident. But that was only because we had very heavy security. We didn't know it at the time, but the governors of Alabama and Mississippi had made a deal with Attorney General Kennedy that they would prevent further violence if the Attorney General didn't object to their arresting the students on local segregation charges. So we made it to Jackson uneventfully and proceeded to fill up the jail there until they sent people out to Parchman because the local jail was too full. And during that summer, a total of 328 people were arrested in Jackson on the Freedom Ride.
Now, Mr. Lillard, what would you like to add to Mr. Walker's descriptions of the Freedom Rides and how dangerous they were?
This is a poster I wish everybody could get a copy of. These are all the faces of American citizens who were arrested in Jackson, Mississippi during the Freedom Ride summer of '61. So about 335 Americans were arrested legally because they wanted to test the laws in Mississippi. And my point is that President Kennedy and Attorney General Kennedy made a deal to basically say it's okay to arrest these citizens of Mississippi. All we're going to guarantee you is we won't kill you. To my mind, that is not the way a democracy should work. No. The reason he did that, because it was a compromise to keep us out the media, because John Kennedy was at the very summer negotiating with Nikita Khrushchev a nuclear arms treaty. And he said to us, basically, you're going to embarrass me, you're going to weaken my hand in negotiating with them damn communists if you stay out there and embarrass the U.S. So on one hand, it's a victory because they weren't killed. But on the other hand, it allowed Mississippi to still win. It still allowed Mississippi to say, we're going to impose on these American citizens our rules that are totally against anything American. So that's the dilemma. We still look back, and we're still reliving, still trying to solve that compromise, right? That's the way I look at it. I spent the whole summer making sure these young folks that came from all over the country to Nashville to be trained in nonviolence, to get their medical records straight, to ship their personal belongings back to their parents, and to buy a ticket for them to go from Nashville to Mississippi jails. That was my summer of '61. And it did prove that young people can make a change. But it did prove also that people like even good liberal white folks like Kennedy still had to settle for Mississippi laws. So there was a yin-yang victory in that. The young folks who went down there changed their lives. And when they got back home, they were different people. And they became catalysts in doing all kinds of things, environmental things, things with elderly, things with disabled people, things with feminine issues. So the movement did catalyze a lot of new change agents, and that was the summer.
Now, weren't some of these students, if not most of them, sent to the Parchman prison?
Yes, let me just add one thing, Barbara, as far as the Freedom Ride was concerned. It was the largest major demonstration that had taken place in the country at that time involving blacks and whites. And I think it needs to be noted that there was about 50% black and about 50% white people who took part in the Freedom Ride.
That's truly amazing. Mm-hmm. And so the Freedom Rides ended up being quite successful beyond many people's belief. And the two of you come back to Nashville. It's the hot summertime. And what do people do in the hot summertime when they get home and have a little time to relax?
They want to swim, except this character was bored. After spending all the time in jail, he was very bored. So he came back and said, Kwame, let's go to the nicest, largest, most luxurious swimming pool for white people, Centennial Park. If you've ever been to Centennial Park, when you go in the park, there's a brick wall around a little building. Well, that used to be the big pool until Matthew and I decided to go swimming on July, what was it, July?
Sometime in July
16th. Now, we knew we couldn't get in, but we were bored, all right? So we decided to walk up to the place where you buy your pass to go swimming. We had a towel and 25 cents. And the little lady there said, what do you want? We said, we want to go swimming. They said, you know, you can't swim in this pool. This is for white people. So we said, well, we just going to wait until you let us in. Immediately, she called the mayor, Mayor West. Mayor West immediately responded with, tell them you know what, that they're not going to swim in that pool, and tell them they're not going to swim in any pool in Nashville. But before we left that pool entrance, Mayor West had drained 27 pools in Nashville, Tennessee. And they stayed drained for 2 years.
They drained the water out of the public swimming pools to keep African Americans from swimming there. And what else happened to the pools in a day or two?
Well, they filled them with rocks, and they converted that into an art center. So it's to repurpose the old pool. And that's what it is now. It's an art center.
Now, do you have anything else to add before we let our students and our audience ask some questions?
Yes. There was a fact about the 60s and about 1960 and 1961. I don't know if any of you study anthropology, have studied anthropologists, but one of the most famous anthropologists of all time, Margaret Mead, had said that never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change history. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Now that was true then, and it's just as true now. So I just want to share it with you.
And we weren't high IQ people. We weren't setting the curves in every test. And that's something, we were just ordinary people doing very extraordinary things. And I think that was a lesson. We never doubt what you can do. Never let fear control you. And never assume that somebody doesn't think the way you think and is willing to sacrifice.
And so people who considered themselves ordinary participated in these extraordinary events, and they did change the world, and the world still needs dedicated, committed people who are willing to take the risk and write things that they know to be wrong. Thank you very much. This has been such a powerful and provocative program.